And first of all, can I welcome everybody very much indeed for turning out to this fringe event this afternoon, this evening. My name is Oliver Colvile. I'm the Member of Parliament for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, and I am just been appointed, or elected rather, the Chairman of the All Party Parliamentary Group on the private rented sector, so I won't be as up to speed as I should be. We've just produced we are in the process of producing a report about regulation, and we're going to do that. But without further ado, I'm going to ask John Redwood if he would like to open up the proceedings, speaking for about 10 minutes. I understand that you can't say the whole of it. You want to shove off to other things, and then we'll move on to other people as well. So, John, can I thank you very much for becoming a former cabinet minister and leading contender for the Conservative Party, and also one of our more thinking members of Parliament, if I might say, and always willing to give us some thoughts as well. We're very interested to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I chair the Economic Affairs Committee for the Conservatives, and our big task over the next year is to complete the work and present to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister our report on what should go into the manifesto over the economic subjects. So a report back through Oliver from you will be very valuable. Expanding the private rented sector and getting a better answer for landlords and tenants will be an important part of that work, and we look forward to more ideas. The first question is, how do we pay for an expanded private rented sector? There I think that the government is well advanced with a number of important ideas. I think that the funding for lending scheme is beginning to work in ways that quantitative easing weren't so direct. So I think now we do have a group of banks, some of which are now well financed and stable in the private sector, and two other big ones which still have state shareholdings, where there is a bit more work in progress, but supported by funding for lending, and now in much better shape than they were 5 years ago. So I do think now we're in a position to say to you that expansion, private rented, using some borrowed money is feasible. And if any of you are still encountering serious difficulties, both the business department under Cable and the Treasury under George Osborne would like to know chapter and verse, because the intention of the policy is to make sure there is a more reasonable flow of lending money into the private rented sector. At the bigger end of the scale, there are active negotiations and discussions underway with institutional investors. I think residential, perhaps for the first time in my investment and political lifetime, is becoming of interest to the investment community in Britain, more common in overseas countries. And they are beginning to solve some of the management difficulties of having relatively small individual units of investment and multiplicity of tenants to manage. And the government is certainly encouraging more private capital to go into infrastructure in general and private rented housing in particular. I myself had discussions last week with leading pension funds about how they can harness more of their savers' money into new work, new investment, rather than simply buying second-hand shares in companies and investments that are already up and running. And I think there is, in principle, an agreement that that would be an attractive way for them. So, again, ideas you may have on how more institutional money can be harnessed at the bigger end would be very welcome. Some of the difficulties, I think, particularly for the smaller entrepreneurial private landlords, lie in the relationships with councils and with the regulatory background. The government has been most active in trying to change and improve the planning background. The government as a whole, both sides of the coalition, and most ministers agree that planning in Britain has been unduly restrictive. They also think, though, that more local involvement is a good idea, so trying to marry the two is not without its difficulties. The way it's been done is to say that more emphasis will be placed upon the local plan to strengthen the local input, but around a proposition that there should be generally a more favourable presumption that suitable land can be developed than there has been in the past, and a wish to get rid of quite a lot of the delay. The delay is cost, and it is very unsatisfactory. If the answer has to be no, it would be better to know quickly before you've spent a fortune on consultants and lawyers and consultation exercises and the like. The better where the answer is yes, and again, speed can be important. You don't want to have to own and hold the land for too long without having productive investment on it, and you want to be able to get on with the house construction or the house ownership so that you can rent it out and have a successful investment. So I would hope that you're finding some improvements there, and if you're not, again, you're pressing on an open door with ministers that they really do wish to make this work a bit better in the interest of housing many more people. We do all, I think, accept, all three main political parties accept, most people in the debate accept, that we are underhoused, that we are a country that needs more housing, particularly in the more successful, economically active areas where people naturally come because there are jobs, and it's quite difficult to find housing at a sensible price, or sometimes any type of housing at all. We then get into the more difficult areas where you are much more expert than I am of landlord-tenant law and local authority regulation of tenancies. And I start from the proposition that I primarily want a sensible, balanced law which both landlords and tenants feel is fair and they can use. And I want as many things as possible to be settled by private contract. These are individual negotiations in many cases. Each property is usually slightly different, or quite a lot different, from the neighbour. The length of the contract may differ. The number of facilities in the property may differ. The service element may range from nothing to quite extensive. So all these things have to be thought through and dealt with individually. So it seems to me the most flexible scheme is a strong, clear law with tenants' rights and landlords' rights, methods of adjudicating where things go wrong, and ultimately right of redress through the courts if things go really wrong for either party. And you don't really want too much regulation intervening or superimposed, but we live in the world we live in. It is a very regulated world now, and councils and others are very keen to be involved. So what we are looking at, we'll be looking at in the run-up to the election, is that balance between proper landlord-tenant law. Is it all right? Does it need any changes or improvements? And can there be ways in which decent landlords and reasonable tenants can get on with each other without very much external regulatory interference, because there is that landlord-tenant law. We don't have any answers at the moment. We're still in the early days of exploring this. That's why this is a very opportune event, and I look forward again to report back from your chairman on where you think the conversation can go. We'll be very happy to receive a paper or whatever if you feel there are proposals you would like to draw people's attention. Overall, we want to get to a world where there is more housing, where there is more housing that people can afford at a sensible level of their income. But we are conservatives. We believe the market is usually the best way of making provision, and we understand that markets only work if the deal makes sense for both sides, that there has to be something in it for the provider and the seller as well as for the buyer and the user. The big advantage as to why it should be possible to get something more going at the moment is that short-term official interest rates are very low. Quite a lot of interest rates are pretty low. We want people to take advantage of that by borrowing sensible amounts of money, because it should be possible to get a return on that capital with a prudent element of borrowed money in the mix, so that your investment is worthwhile and the equity money you put in is working harder for you by virtue of sensible levels of gearing of loan capital. So there is the opportunity. A government wants to help with planning, wants to help on the regulatory side, feels it is helping quite a lot through and with the banks on the funding and the money side. There is a big task out there to create a lot more private rented housing as well as private housing for sale. And we're very open to ideas on how we could make more progress.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed, John, for that. Now, I'm very aware that you've got to show off in a moment, so I'm very keen, though, that people should have the opportunity of asking some questions.
Yes, I've got another terms or so.
That's brilliant. So, can we have the first, and what I'd be very grateful for someone to do is just make sure when they're asking their questions, can you just say who you are and where you come from, which constituency, or what your interest might be? All right, sir. Yes.
Hi, I'm Robbie Santos from Shelter. Really interesting to hear you're looking at this in much more detail. I was just wondering what your initial assessment is of tenants' market power and how able are they at the moment to negotiate different contracts, and kind of what scope of proposal are you looking at?
I think it's very variable, both in relation to the tenant and how much support they have, because these are often complicated difficult agreements, and very variable by location, because clearly a potential tenant has much more power if there are a lot of empty properties and not many takers, and you have very little power as a potential tenant, even if you're very articulate and a trained lawyer. You don't have much power if there's a raging bull market in property in the area you want to rent it. So I think it's a combination of two things. And again, I think we'd be very interested in solutions to where there isn't enough tenant power. I've already dealt with the question of provision, and if we are successful in getting more provision, there'll be better balance in the overheated areas, which will help a great deal with the matter you rightly describe. I think it would also be interesting to know if there are ways of helping tenants who just find it all too complex, because some of the agreements now are extremely long, very difficult, and really do require quite a lot of patient analysis. And then if you get to the point where you don't like clause 63A, you may not be able to do anything about it anyway. So again, there is an issue there.
Kevin Allen, National Private Tenants Organisation. Just some comments on there's some interesting developments in legislation in Scotland in terms of the tenant information packs which are provided to tenants when they look for tenancy, and also the repairing standard which is provided as a prerequisite to letting. I wonder if the government might consider those, or looking at those as models which might help adjust the balance between landlords and tenants.
Well, I think I'd certainly be very interested in the work I do for the party in looking at any element of that you thought was a good idea. And if there is now some back history on how it's worked in practice, that's even more valuable, because it's quite nice to somebody else to have done the pioneering and to see what the pluses and minuses were. So we're very happy to take evidence on that.
Thank you. Sir.
Dave Roberts from the Family and Childcare Trust. It's a little bit to the left field of the main part of what you were saying, John, but it's the lodgers allowance is the question about raising the lodgers allowance for live-in landlords in order to allow people to maximise their property, whether it's owned or whether they're subletting when that's allowed or whatever, because it hasn't been raised since May 1997. Whether that's something that the party will be looking at.
We'll certainly look at it, yes. I mean, there are no plans at the moment to do anything about it, but I think, again, it's an interesting idea. And I've seen some very good examples of people who have a largish house, their children are left home, they quite want to stay in their own house, sometimes a bit lonely, even a couple can be quite lonely, so then they rent it out to a student, for example, and it works very well for both parties. The couple quite like having a young person around the house and the extra income, and the young person has a home from home, and with the right people it can work very well. So I think it can be a model that works, or for a young professional or a young person who's trying to make a life and a living in a new town or a new city away from their parental home in their early 20s. They haven't got the deposit for the house, they don't want to make that commitment yet again. I think that can be quite a useful model, so I'm very happy to look at ideas that might support that.
Joe Cersei, Step Change, the Debt Advice Charity. We've seen a huge rise recently in the number of people come to us with private renters with rent arrears, and it seems in a lot of cases that's driven by other essential questions like council tax bills or fuel bills. And I just wondered whether, just a general question really, whether you thought there's a better way, a better mechanism for private landlords to be put into discuss with the local council, utility providers, in order to really understand the questions like
I think the best answer is for us to come up with a solution to the underlying problem, which is that people's living standards have been falling for quite a long time now. They had a very sharp fall at the end of the last decade during the Great Recession, and they continue to fall gently, but they've still been falling in the first 3 years of this decade. So all the main political parties are now going to be competing for your attention over the next 2 years on how they want to tackle that. We heard the Chancellor today offer part of his solution, which is the freeze on fuel duty and some measures on housing, and I'm sure he will be coming up with other measures in the months and budgets ahead to try and ease the squeeze. And we've heard Mr. Miliband's answer, which we obviously disagree with, but we understand what he's trying to do. So I think all political parties and governments, potential governments, understand that the underlying problem is that the utility bill and the council tax bill and the fuel bill and the rent can be too much. It's just too difficult if you're on a relatively low income. So we need to work away on that range of costs. We've also had the council tax freeze, of course. We also need to work away on promoting the kind of economic recovery which gives people better paid jobs. My party is certainly not wanting people to have low paid jobs. Sometimes we're tarred with that brush. It's the last thing I want. I want people to go from a not very well paid job to a better paid job. I think it's easier to get to a better paid job from a not very well paid job than to get there straight from unemployment. So I think maybe you need some of those starter jobs to get people going. But we want to get people promoted so that they have more income. On the more narrow point you raise, which is what when things go wrong, we'd rather have fewer things going wrong, and that requires a general economic answer. Then yes, it may well be that we need to look at new ways of engaging private landlord in the conversation with those dealing with the housing benefit and other income support issues which the council is involved with. And again, I'm very open to thoughts on how that could be improved. Because the council is by definition usually in the lead on all this because they're the main conduit for the public money. And if there's better ways for them to do that and to use it, we're very happy to do it. So.
Richard Powell from a property company called Capco. We're promoting PRS and with discussions with the PRS task force. There's a tool called the debt guarantee which is being promoted at the moment, which looks like a game changer for the scale of investment, particularly in London. I don't know whether that's something you're promoting, watching with interest, or whether that's something you see as unlocking the potential for major and significant investment in that sector.
No, I think it's very interesting. I'm not sure there's an additional role for government, but I'm very happy to stand corrected if you think something else government needs to do to assist with this.
Yeah, the infrastructure guarantees are in place for transport systems, etc., for private finance. It seems that similar tools in place for the private rented sector. I think any guarantee that the Treasury puts forward just needs to be very thought through and as simple as possible. So anything that this group can do to simplify it and speed it up and bring it through, I think is a potential game changer.
Yes, I mean, I haven't seen a costly proposal because I don't think guarantees are cost-free. They have a value, clearly. You're only asking for one because there may be a risk you need to insure. So I'd be very happy to look at the proposal, but I would want to know what the range of risk was and effectively what the insurance cost is and why it can't be covered by a private investor.
Well, John, thank you very, very much indeed for giving your time up for us. I know you've got a number of other things to go and do, but it's been very, very good.
You're welcome to do another subject now. But anyway, thank you very much.
Right. I'm going to move now and ask Alan if he would like to say a few words for us as well. Now, as I understand, you're the chairman of the Residential Landlords. Oh, sorry.
Alan is indeed, but I'm Alan.
So, Alan, would you like to give us some words as well? And what we'll then do is then ask Alex to end up by doing his bit as well, and we want to have some questions from you too.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here, and also to Oliver, Alex, and in his and Sir John for supporting this event from the Residential Landlords Association. Private rented sector, private rented housing, manifesto for growth, the topic here. PRS has 18% of the market now, it's growing, but why is renting seen as the second choice? Why is it not the first choice in housing? Why is it second best? Why can I, as a landlord, and I am a landlord, Oliver Chairman, why can I buy an old house and refurbish it for less than the cost of a new one? There's actually an anomaly in why landlords don't, so few of them actually build to rent, and I'll come to that later. Why is a landlord called a rogue, or Rackman, or Rigsby? It's very interesting, your question earlier about living landlord, because Rigsby, of course, was a living landlord, and there aren't that many of them these days. But there are so many questions, and very little time to tell you all the answers, but we have today one of the biggest social crises in the lack of housing, the demand that is pent up. So can the private rental sector solve the problem of this 100,000 shortfall every year in new homes that are required? As I said, Rigsby is an anachronism, so is Rackman. He was a very interesting character actually from the 50s and 60s. And that was a period of rent control. Now some people would like to see rent control returned to deal with the inflation that is going on in the London market. But you mustn't confuse the London market with the rest of the country. My first point is please don't even think about rent control or its half-sister indexation. I know it's contrary anyway to this government's philosophy, but there are a number of local authorities in London who would like to see some form of limit. But it must be resisted if we're going to encourage investment from the corporate and the private sector. I mean, we had rent control before the PRS from 55% in 1939 to just 8% in 88. And that was the year when Margaret Thatcher's government brought in the Housing Act, which currently underpins the private rented sector. The one that gives us the fundamental right, as landlords and as lenders, the fundamental right to repossess, for example, if a tenant doesn't pay the rent. In fact, landlords only end a tenancy in 9% of cases. That's not court cases, that's all tenancies. And the courts are in a terrible mess. It really is the last resort for landlords. You may not realise, but it can take up to 10 months for a landlord to regain possession, and in that period we're not going to get the rent either. So point 2 is for landlords who need court judgment, we need to speed that up if the process is vital to maintain control of the asset. So just 9% of tenancies are ended by landlords. Perhaps that's hard to believe, but if so, perhaps you've been reading too many reports from Shelter, Robbie, about these rogue landlords. Shelter says that you have 85,000 cases a year from tenants. Right? Okay, well anyway, I've read
44% of our clients are private renters compared to 17% of the affordable population.
Right.
It's not my fringe.
It's okay, but anyway, that figure, 85,000, is actually out of 8.5 million tenants in this country. It's less than 1%. So my point is that landlords are doing a pretty good job. Unfortunately, there is a tiny minority who spoil the reputation of the majority. These are landlords, no, these are criminals actually, who fail to provide gas certificates contrary to the 88 Gas Safety Act, who fill sheds with beds and immigrants contrary to the 85 Landlord and Tenant Act and the 84 Tenant Act, and those landlords who don't meet conditions of decency and safety from the 100 other laws that control the private rented sector already. So some of those actually date back to 1730, and what we lack, I'm sorry I can't reinforce this point to John, but there hasn't been any review of the cumulative impact of these acts, and there have been 20 more since the 2004 Housing Act. Now the government has a red tape challenge, but I'm really not seeing very much of that in the private rented sector. The government's objective is actually being undermined locally by selective licensing and planning regulations. Let me explain. 35 towns and cities have introduced planning laws, Manchester's case, across the whole of the city, to control shared houses using a measure called an Article 4 direction. And it's not just the student market they're attacking, it's the affordable shared houses that are vital to half of the market. Half of the rental market are tenants aged under 35. And Article 4 means that if you are looking to buy a house for your student son or daughter for them to share in their second or third year at uni, well, you've got to be very careful, because you could contravene an Article 4 direction. And if you have a house that's currently rented to a family, and you want to rent it to a group of, say, 4 nurses sharing, again, you're going to have to get planning permission to do that. Well, I'm sorry, these are planning controls being used to control the behaviour of tenants. So my urban myth number 1 for you is that landlords control the behaviour of tenants. I'm sorry, I have as much chance of getting an eviction for a tenant for antisocial behaviour as Labour have of getting a 100-seat majority in 2 years' time. The planning controls completely misunderstand the dynamics of the PRS. The stable doors shut and the horses are a mile down the road. The properties causing the problems are actually large HMOs, and this measure, Article 4, affects small family homes. It's frozen the market, and it's not solved the problem. And if anybody's been listening in the town hall here, it's actually reduced the value of owner-occupied houses in the affected areas by about 1/3. Now, urban myth number 2 is that selective licensing improves the private rented sector. Up the road in Burnley, they've actually prosecuted 1 landlord in the last 5 years, and they're proposing to renew selective licensing on the basis of low demand. And yet at a recent public meeting, the council in Burnley said that they had no funding to make improvements in the areas, no hope of facelifts, because of the cutbacks. But the government guidelines actually say that licensing should be part of a multi-layered approach to tackling low demand. But without investment in the area, how are they going to alleviate that low demand? And of course, not of course, but they are proposing to take a licence fee of £900 per property. That's 2 months' rent. So for an area of low demand, that just defies logic. On the positive side for Manchester, they've actually rejected licensing, and in Bournemouth, they're the only local authority which has proposed licensing, and then rejected it after consultation, so we welcome that. But my third point is we don't actually need any more laws, we need better enforcement. So scrap the Article 4 directions for small houses and use licensing to improve areas, to encourage investment and to raise standards. I want them to target the criminals and not tax the good guys with unnecessary bureaucracy. Really, they're just creating jobs for the boys and girls. What we need is smart enforcement, one which allows local authorities to concentrate on the criminals. I want robust self-regulation for the compliant majority of landlords who are providing decent homes that are safe, legal and secure. What we want in the RLA is a twin-track approach. Self-regulation for these compliant landlords with a nationally recognised accreditation system supported by a code of conduct, and also some recognition, some simple form of recognition for tenants, a safe home logo, if you like. Our proposals would include a searchable online database. We've got to be able to recognise these landlords, and also to introduce dispute resolution, rather as will happen shortly for letting agents. And I would also like councils to get a banning order which would enable them to disqualify criminal landlords from operating or managing properties in the private rented sector. Our proposal would actually save money, because I want local authorities to cease to have the monopoly of regulation. It works in building control. There are independent bodies who provide building control. That allows the local authorities to concentrate on the enforcement. So it just releases them from this pointless box ticking, which for most authorities is what selective licensing is. My final point is a financial one. I'd like to thank Gordon Brown for something, and it's not for losing the last election. When he took away pension tax credits in '97, I'm not going to thank him for that either, but it actually coincided with the launch of buy-to-let, and it's the basic reason for the growth of the private rented sector. Landlords and investors have actually added 1 million homes to the sector in the last decade. Now, there are 1.2 million of us in the private sector. Over 90% are individuals, and 70% have just one property. And the RLA's research shows that most landlords are in it for the long term, but our income is actually taxed as unearned. Now, in a report for the RLA, Professor Michael Ball has showed that the real return for landlords is less than 1%. Now, if you take account of the time spent managing the property, marketing it, referencing the tenants, doing the viewings, doing inventories, protecting the deposit, managing the tenancy, maintaining the property, chasing the decorators and the electricians and the plumbers and so forth, and in many cases actually doing the work ourselves, you'll find it's not unreasonably called sweat equity. And a lot of us know why, and I think it's very interesting that the title of this conference is for hard-working people. I put it to you that landlords are hard-working people. Yes, we do get capital allowances, but we only get those when we sell a property, and then we get stuffed for capital gains tax. Now, landlords have asked for rollover tax relief and be treated like any other business. So that would encourage us to reinvest and to encourage property sales and to refurbish the next property by reinvesting the proceeds of one. Professor Ball has stated also that for every £1 invested in the private rented sector, it generates £3.50 within building work and fittings within properties as well. So we do deserve to be treated like a business. And finally, that anomaly on building to rent. If you build a house for yourself, you get the 20% VAT back. But as a landlord, I'm specifically excluded from that. So we pay a premium on new build. And I'm sure the corporates have a way around it, but we don't need a two-tier private rented sector. New stock is vital, and it will improve standards, and the rollover tax relief would energise the market and encourage refurbishment. So to summarise, what I want is for the market to decide on the rents. We've got to fix the court system. We've got to review the 100 laws and get rid of the red tape and allow the good landlords to self-regulate so that councils can prosecute the criminals and also treat us as a business with fair taxation. The private rented sector, in my view, is the way to grow.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I'm going to ask Alex now if he would like to say a few words as well, and then we'll have some questions. All right.
Thanks. Always interesting to be asked to discuss these things. I always start off, so I was at something this morning about social housing and something on private home ownership, and I'm here today. The argument about particular sectors, I think, is much less important from the outside looking in. But the key issue is how supply can be increased as a whole. And unless you increase the supply of housing in this country, what is a basically horrific economic and social crisis will only get worse. I mean, it's often held up that housing is the example, a perfect example of market failings. Big developers only build 150,000 homes a year since World War II. Unsurprisingly, this is a bit of a sleight of hand. Of course, the current planning system, which is basically a land rationing system, but not just a land rationing, a planning permissions rationing system, because you can't even densify the existing urban areas very efficiently, was brought in 1947, and since 1947 we have never managed to build more than about 150,000 private homes. The key issue for any government has to be to increase the number of homes being built in this country to in line with demand, and in line with demand is not household demand. There are lots of people nowadays who are small two-person households living in large family homes, which means that you have to increase the amount of housing space that you are providing, because you've got people who are an older generation who are living much longer, which is a great thing, but it means that you then have to build family homes to replace the homes that would have been there if people, as they used to, died earlier. So it's a question of what is driving demand and it's mostly to do with an ageing population. What is stopping supply? And ultimately it is both the development industry and the way that planning works. I mean, building requirements are a very dull technical thing, but for example in London you could not build most of Notting Hill, Pimlico, partly because you would need a lift if anything was 4 stories or above. You can't build raised ground floors because that's against access requirements. You can't build narrow stairways because that's against access requirements. If you're redeveloping a estate that has any open space, you must at least maintain, if not increase, the open space, and so on and so on and so forth. So basically what happens is our planning system acts as a bureaucratic imposition of this is what housing must look like, this is where it will go. There is almost no trade-off, in the same way that almost every other area of life, I want something, you want something, and we sit down and negotiate until both of us are reasonably satisfied. What should the planning system be about is about empowering local communities so that they can negotiate directly with developers. That is not the point of the planning system as it's currently constituted, and unsurprisingly a system that basically is about winner takes all ends up building very, very little, and what it does build is of insufficient quality. So that sort of, I suppose, the idea that the government should focus on private rented, the PRS as a way to increase supply, the main thing that the government needs to do is radically reconfigure the planning system so that quality is controlled by local people and negotiations take place directly between local people and developers rather than trying to micromanage everything centrally or at a council level. And interestingly enough, I'm sceptical of the MPPF working with the idea that you give control back to local councils. It's already being undermined to some extent because you get planning by appeal, because councils don't do as they're told. So in the 80s we had councils, then we had planning by appeal under Thatcher, then we had councils in the 90s, then we had regional planning under Labour, now we have the MPPF for its councils, and finally we're going back to planning by appeal. So it's a sort of endless iteration of who is in control of the planning system rather than let's create a planning system that is about saying, you local people, developers, sit down and come up with something that suits both of you. So I don't support the idea that taxation, I thought the point about VAT was very interesting, but in general I think the idea that the PRS needs to have special treatment is one that should be opposed. The private rented sector of course cannot buy land because land bought by speculative house builders, they can afford to pay a higher price because you will pay more now for a home if you think prices will rise, which most people do. So therefore you can't get the land at a value, at the current value. You have to pay what is an expected premium, which is why house prices tend to advance faster than rents. In countries that do have large amounts of built for rent, it tends to be you have reasonably stable land and house prices, which means that the private rented sector can afford to purchase land rather than being outbid by speculative developers. I think it's one of those, the idea of build to rent is one of those ideas that circulates endlessly around Westminster without civil servants grasping quite what the market structures it is and why it hasn't emerged of its own accord. And I don't think it will get anywhere until you fix that wider point about the planning system. The point about bad landlords, it's very true that they're a very small minority. I take Shelter's point that doesn't mean that you can't do something about it, but I think some people are very careful about using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. There is a problem with people who basically break the law and treat tenants horrendously. Is that problem solved by creating more new laws? Well, obviously not, because most of the time the landlords who are quote-unquote rogue tend to be operating outside the law. Anyway, I also think it's an extreme danger, and let's hope that the government doesn't go down this route, that you try and push to solve the fact that there are now more people in their late 20s and 30s living at home. If you try and push for default longer contracts, that ends up screwing up the labour market for lots of people in their early to mid-20s who actually like having very short-term contracts. And I think that at the moment there's a push to solve one problem, i.e. people in their 30s who have families, but all that will do is then you'll push that problem down, you'll create another problem where people in their 20s who actually want lots of flexibility will lose out. And I think these things are best left, as John said, to private contracts between individuals. The point about planning regulations being used in Article 4, which is very interesting, I didn't realise quite how widespread it was. I doubt in some ways if this idea that you should spread, that every community should be an exact mixed community, that it's almost the government's job to make sure there's a certain portion of old people, young people, etc. I just don't think it's realistic. I quite liked living with lots of other students because we had reasonably loud parties. Now I'm 30, I don't quite like loud parties as much, and I'm guessing by the time I'm 60 I will like them even less. So there is a certain amount of, people have...
I don't think you're quite right on that. But
Okay, well, there we go. Maybe it levels off at a certain level. But the point is that I think areas do change, and there's not that much you can do about it. If you have people who are being loud and antisocial and causing problems, come down on people who are being loud and antisocial and causing problems. Don't try and sort of create endless pieces of micromanagement that then try and that tackle a problem that is essentially, again, deal with people who are doing something that is wrong rather than creating more micromanagement. And finally, on sort of rent levels and housing benefits, I mean, I do think rents will continue to rise until we get a grip on the issue of supply, which ultimately comes down to an issue of reforming planning to make it less winner-takes-all and more conciliatory. However, I do think the governments of both stripes will begin to start looking quite desperately at that. You're getting close to £25 billion, which is a hell of a lot of money. It's not far off. I think in about possibly in this decade, it'll probably overtake defence spending, for example. I mean, that is a level of spending on something that no one wants to spend, that is just very, very high. And I think you will find increasing pressure for bad policies. The rent cap, the idea of having I think lots of people in London, in Labour, are very keen on that. I think it is a big danger. Problem is, I don't think it'll actually have as much of an impact on supply, because it will just reduce the land values in London. I think those who want to argue against rent caps, and I would include myself in that group, have to find a way to explain that actually it's going to be the weird impact of that will be most problematic. So, for example, if you have an area that is gentrifying, by holding down the rental prices in that area, what will happen is that more people will move into a wider area. It's quite hard to explain, but the point is that, say you opened a new tube in East London, and you say that you can only rise rents 5% a year. Well, that's fine. What would happen is there would be more middle class people would still move to that area, but they would move into a wider catchment area, because the 5% rise that would have happened, that some of the people who would have lived really close and paid more will still want to live in that area, but will a little bit further out. So rather than having a particularly high, narrow increase, you would have a flatter increase. So across London as a whole, whatever the cap is, all that happens is bits go down, but other bits go up. So I think we have to be more sophisticated about how we argue against what is a very bad proposition, which is rent prices. But I also think we need to get away from that by doing the right thing and fixing the planning system to build enough homes that you don't need a rent cap. So that's my piece, I suppose. On to questions.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed for doing that. Now, who's going to open the batting then, if I might? Yes, sir. If you just say who you are and whereabouts you come from.
David Lewis from I live in Bury,
Right.
that's Salford Conservative constituency.
Right.
And I'm a private landlord. All my properties are in the Accrington area. First of all, just endorse one or two comments that Alan Ward has said. We are not social pariahs. Most of us are respectable people, respectable businessmen, people, and we want to provide a good service. We provide a very important service to the facilities of the housing stock in this country, and we want to be seen as partners rather than people who are outside the system. Good landlords want to provide a good service to tenants. It costs us money when tenants leave. What we want is tenants who will stay and be happy. So that's our goal, because it's financially very costly for tenants leave. We have to redecorate, we have to make repairs. So it's much easier, it's much more economically beneficial for us to have the tenants who are going to be happy and like where they are, and could, a rent they can afford to pay, and a house that is maintained for them. Yes, I would endorse Alan's comments that we do provide a good service, and we are legitimate people. This time last year, I was most concerned about, this is the question now, this time last year I was most concerned about the effect of direct payment of the universal credit benefit. And I pleaded with Lord Freud to consider the fact that there are many people who would be unable to budget if they had their rent paid to them rather than the landlord, especially on a monthly basis. Since which time things seem to have changed somewhat. Could you tell me, or can you tell me what's the current situation? Because it seems to be fairly flexible. There seems to be a softening of the of the policy that every tenant would get the rent paid to them, as opposed to directly to the landlord.
Okay. Would you like to open that?
I went to hear Lord Freud this afternoon, speaking at a Salvation Army fringe event. It seems to me that well, in fact, he admitted that the situation is a lot more complicated than they first thought. And that's the bottom line. They haven't really resolved it yet. A word which you will come to hear is sanctions. So when a tenant has been sanctioned, and the sanction will be when they've failed to comply with whatever the terms of their benefit are. If they don't submit, for example, 10 job applications a week to get themselves off unemployment, that is a requirement, and if they don't do that, they will lose, we're not sure, some or part or all of their benefit. There's still a lot to be worked out, and my colleague Chris Town at the back there is spending a lot of time actually working on this. It's exceedingly complicated. The objective is to have it in, we know, by 2017, and that as yet seems to be still a little bit prospective. I think a lot of us would agree with the basic plan, which is to simplify benefits and consolidate into one. But for many tenants struggling with their own finances, I mean, one of the key objectives is for them to have personal responsibility. So once a month they will get a large chunk of money. And the sensible thing would be to pay the landlord for it. But if they are in a chaotic lifestyle, we know quite well that we're damn lucky to get it. You know, you've got Christmas coming up, it always happens.
We know that, Lord Freud doesn't seem to know that.
I think he does, I think he hears it, but as yet the reality hasn't kicked in. And there were a few people, after in fact speaking to some of the Salvation Army staff there, they said they don't see how it's going to work.
I agree. I think they like the principle of trying to encourage independence. They recognise that there are problems, particularly for people who lead, as you say, chaotic lifestyles, and also just don't have much money. So they are tempted at times like Christmas and other times to try and get on the rent. I don't think they've resolved it yet. So basically keep badgering away, and anything that you can do that's practical that they can use to get out of it, they probably will go for.
I may certainly agree with you. I think that there is an issue here. When I raised this with Ian Smith probably about a year ago, he said, well, if landlords would be willing to reduce the rent, then we would actually be interested in doing it, because they're obviously looking at trying to reducing their housing benefit. Right, yes.
Slightly follows on. My name's Helen Matthew, I work at Homeless Link. I kind of very much welcome, the idea of increasing supply in the private rented sector.
Yeah.
My question is, we've done quite a lot of work, and other organisations have as well, that shows, for the reasons that colleagues just outlined, a very low percentage of landlords are often willing to rent to those people claiming benefits. Direct payments, the reduction in local housing allowance rates are all contributing to perception that there are a lot of other possibly more desirable tenants who have higher income and are prepared to pay more. I wondered what your kind of view is of that low percentage, and is it something that kind of is interesting to you in terms of how we can kind of raise that? Obviously that's from a particular perspective, but kind of is there more that we can do to make sure PRS is accessible to a wider number of people?
Okay. Alex, I'm going to ask you to kick off on this one.
I just think that as supply gets more pressured and prices invariably rise, the people who lose out the most tend to be the people who have the weakest bargaining power. The main priority continues to be, and what we argue for almost till we're blue in the face, and I'm sick of saying it, is to build more homes. And the way that you do that is by changing a system that was built in the 1940s, and that hasn't been fit for purpose for at least 3 decades.
There are very few landlords capable of dealing with complexities, and it's becoming a minority sector. There will tend to be larger landlords with the skills and expertise to be able to focus on it and concentrate on it. I share Alex's view that if there are more properties coming into the market, then other landlords will perhaps be wanting to turn their attention to it. We've learned a lesson from local housing allowance, haven't we? One of the benefits of that is that we do get direct payments. One of the great difficulties about universal credit is at the moment we're not going to get it. And what we really want is for them to passport tenants who are already on LHA, where the landlord is getting direct payment, to passport that into universal credit. That's one of our negotiating points.
I also think there's a point about the social housing sector, which used to be able to house more people, is just under such, because the housing costs are just rising exponentially, the social housing sector is also unable to house perhaps as many people as it might have, say, 15 or 20 years ago. So again, it comes back to this fundamental logjam. The more that happens, the whole area gets worse. And there are people who would have gone to the social housing sector, and these tenants are more risky. There is a pool of people who are prepared to take on that risk. Some of the people who have used to go into the social housing sector are now going to the PRS. The pool of risk, as it were, is not big enough to accommodate all of those people. And that's so again, it comes back to everything sort of comes from a big Gordian knot of we build 100,000 homes when we probably need to build 300,000 homes, and we've done that for God knows how many years.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, Charlotte Davis from the CLA. Our members have a lot, if not most, of the private rented sector housing in rural areas, and for them, their biggest problem is actually the energy performance certificates, which, while fit for purpose for new build houses, actually don't work for traditional housing. They can't accurately test 9-inch brick, and it means that the majority of our members' housing stock will fail the energy performance certificate, and that will see them sell that housing stock off, or leave it lying empty like they did during periods of rent control. So never mind talking about growing the private rented sector, that runs the risk in rural areas of almost completely annihilating it. So that's definitely something that I think needs to be looked at.
Thank you, Charlotte, for that. Right.
On that one, there's a very great weakness in the theory behind the SAP ratings, and I totally sympathise with you. And I'm trying to think of the report that was written, and you could probably tell me what it was, but it was about some farmhouses with solid stone walls, which when they tested them were actually performing far better than the SAP ratings were giving them.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah. Yes, there's some great dangers, and you haven't even gone on to Green Deal, because that's the nub of the problem. F and G rated properties will be illegal to rent after 2018. It's a big problem.
If I could scrap so many of the things that I hear about, I probably would, including, to be honest, the whole principle of any kind of home. I accept that there's a point about we want to be energy efficient, the idea that it's the government's job to tell people what their minimum standards are. And it often leads to this kind of bureaucratic incompetence. I personally dislike strongly. I mean, it's not an area it's too narrow for our think tank to take on, but personally, it sounds like the kind of thing that you get too much these days. Everyone would be better off if we had less of it.
Jim.
Thank you very much. Don Williams from West Hampstead, London. I am both a landlord and a councillor. And I just have a few observations, a few questions. One is on just looking on the social sector. We hear a lot of bad things about the PRS sector, but not about the social landlords. I can tell you, my own observation is they are not better, and the situation is quite difficult. The only problem is it's very difficult to report the local authority or the social landlords to somebody, and they get away with a lot more murder than the private rented sector. And I wonder whether or not there could be some rebalancing of the whole situation. But coming back to the issue of rent controls, can I just be a little, and I'd love to know if the panel agrees with this. In London, where house prices are going up, and we're looking to control rents, for those people who want to control rents. And I can tell you in northwest London, rents are not going up, and in many cases it's going down. So when we hear this overall picture of what's happening in London, be very careful. There are big areas where things are going in the opposite direction. But why wouldn't a landlord, when he's faced with rent control, not sell his property for a 15 or 20% increase in the value and go and do something else with the money, reducing the housing stock in the rented sector significantly? It really could be, rent control could be a serious problem, not just to keep the stock the same, no more new investment, but to get rid of stock that's already there. And I wonder what the panel thinks about that.
Yes, I have to say I rather agree with you on the issue of RSL, Residential Landlords. Frankly, there is no, because a number of local authorities have been encouraged, both under a Conservative government and a Labour government, to move their properties away from the move council housing into the residential landlord. There is no accountability now, because at least in 4 years' time you would be able to actually vote out the administration which had totally and utterly failed to look after your property properly, and I think that is an issue. But Al, would you like to comment on that?
What, on the complaints about the social sector?
Well, also all the other issues.
Rent control. Rent control.
The rent control one. Yes, well, I mean, the CLG Select Committee rejected it. Montague report rejected rent controls. But it's a very easy phrase to toss into a conversation. But how practically would you do it? Would you say that rent control means that you may not increase the current passing rent for a property as of such a date, and in 12 months' time you might index it by 2.8%? Or do you say that there is a fixed figure for two-bed flats? But whichever you choose, or whatever other regime you choose, who's going to do it? Because we got rid of the rent officer service 10 years ago. So there's a whole bureaucracy in there. You know, to me, rent control is a recipe for slums in 5 and 10 years' time. Because if you haven't got the revenue coming in, then you're not going to be able to maintain it. And okay, we're in a wonderful period of low interest rates at the moment. But 2 days ago, sorry, end of last week, wasn't it? West Bromwich put their rates up 2%. Now, there's a lot of landlords going to suffer from that, and they didn't go for the single buy-to-let policy. They went for borrowers with 4 properties. So there's some big problems going to come there, and that's quite unilateral. I'm sure they can do it under the CML agreement. So somehow they're going to have to afford 2%. Well, if you have rent capping, how would they afford it?
Yeah, the interesting thing for me about rents, I think it would have less of an impact on supply because the system is so inelastic anyway, of generalised housing supply. You might get some shift between tenure, between PRS and owner occupation. But what would happen, you're right, is slums, is how exactly are you going to be able to check that the landlords will find ways, they'll cut down on maintenance costs because the real price should be up here, but actually they know they can charge here, but they can not only they can charge here, they'll find ways to try and make that up. The other point is what will happen is in areas such as North West London where prices are going up much less quickly, because you've decided that you've got a unilateral cap in prime central London, say can only go up 10% a year, some people who would have moved into those areas will move into North West London. So all you do is spread the price rise. It's sort of a sort of socialism of price rises where instead of some areas going at 10%, some areas at 5 and some at say 2, everywhere converges towards 5 because that's the level, because some of the people who would have moved and paid much more to live in an expensive area, now are being pushed out because the price has been held low. Someone else can afford a bigger house than they want, so they then get pushed out a bit further, so that means that price there goes up. So what happens is that the prices spread out, and that's the point I was trying to make, is that rather than having concentrated price rise in a particular area, some of that excess demand shifts to other areas and the whole of London, or the whole of whatever the region is, goes up. So I think it's a disaster. Unfortunately, I can see why in the current climate, when some parties, the Labour Party is struggling, I think, in some ways to see what it wants to do, I can see why it's a cheap populist option.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take 2 more, and we might do these consecutively together, so that we can do it, because I'm very aware there's something else going on quite soon as well. But sir, would you like to ask your 2 questions?
Okay, I'm David Orr, I'm Chief Executive of the National Housing Federation, the body that represents all these social landlords that you dislike, sir.
I also included... I also included local authorities. I actually have to see these properties. It's not just that I dislike them. I see them and I see complaints coming from people who live there.
Yeah, I just want to offer an alternative perspective on some of the issues that have been raised. I have recently been asking in public, in a way that Alan and I have begun to discuss, why it is that rent control has no prospect of working in the UK economy, where some of the most effective private rented sector markets in Europe, Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, have controlled rents in the private sector. I believe that the private rented sector has an incredibly important future role to play, and it needs to be based on the existence of small-scale providers of the kind represented by Alan and his members, and of larger institutional providers, and I hope and expect housing associations to be part of that, attracting institutional finance from some of the major pension companies and others who want to be able to invest in residential but haven't found the best mechanisms for doing so. And my question is, if we were to have an environment where rents are controlled but where there's a guarantee that they will be allowed to rise by at least the rate of inflation, and if you are an investor who likes the prospect of index-linked returns on your investment, does this not begin to create a more benign environment for potential large-scale investors who would help us to build new homes for market rent, rather than just cannibalising the ones that would otherwise be available for first-time buyers? Because indeed, most of the properties that are now in the private rented sector are properties where the competition was between first-time buyers or moving into the private rented sector. Both of those are undersupplied at present, and just changing the tenure of these exact same properties doesn't help to solve the problem. So I agree very profoundly with Alex that the major issue here is the lack of supply. But I think we have to be prepared to think a little more creatively about how you generate the financing that will allow that supply to happen. And if I could just say one word about the environment that housing associations, particularly housing associations, I'll leave others to comment on councils, operate in, they are very closely regulated. Every housing association is required to have a complaints policy. That complaints policy includes the possibility of going directly to your elected representative, and in the event that you are not properly dealt with, there is a housing ombudsman service. None of these things is available in the private rented sector. And I'm not inclined to take an assertion that there is nothing there in terms of accountability. You try running a housing association and you will find just how much accountability there is.
I'm Sarah McFadden from Crisis, the Homelessness Charity. I just wanted to make a really quick point and then ask a question. Just with regards to the issue of letting to benefit claimants, we work with a network of private rented sector access schemes, which are small organisations, usually voluntary organisations, who work to support people who've been homeless or who are vulnerable and who are on housing benefit into the private rented sector. And they do that by providing kind of support to both the tenant and the landlord, and they have a lot of success in setting up tenancies that everyone's happy with. So I think that's a kind of really important model to look at when we're thinking about supporting people into the private rented sector. My question was on tenancy length. I think it is true that a lot of people want flexibility, but other people want more stability, so families or thinking about our clients, people have been homeless and need some stability to kind of get back on their feet again. And it suits landlords as well to have longer tenancies if they're happy with the tenant, they don't want voids. And yet it's quite rare to find a tenancy that's longer than a 6 or 12-month AST. So what sort of things do you think we could be doing to encourage or incentivise longer tenancies with longer or shorter periods?
I'm not sure there's that much we can or should do. I think the market was structured around a different type of client a long time ago. It's still, the inertia of any system continues a long period. I think you will probably see, I don't think long term, but maybe 2 or 3 year tenancies becoming more common over time as the demographics of the PRS shifts. On the point about David's point, about supply, the countries where you do have some institutional investment, though it's never a huge proportion of suppliers, whereas I think in Germany, I think 20% or less in fact, then the reason is that they have stable land. If you have stable land and house prices, then there is no great gap between what you would pay, what you think you'll pay for a house in 10 years. So you're not prepared to pay more now than you have to. Whereas in Britain, everyone thinks that prices will just go up and up. So obviously, people will mortgage themselves to the hilt. So you get a speculative bubble building on what is already a massive undersupply. And we've had this discussion in many ways. I dream of the day when we could build as many attractive homes as Germany. I think they peaked in the sort of late 90s about 600,000 homes a year for a population that's not that much above Britain. So I think you just have to keep coming back to this problem. The planning system doesn't work for the existing communities, and it doesn't work for the people who desperately need housing. That's where the attention is. And often politicians can be, not the current ones. I'm a huge fan of Briskin Bowles, but sometimes politicians can be simple creatures, and if you give them too much to think about, they can be distracted from the core thing. And the core thing in this is the planning system, and the planning system does not allow us to build enough homes, and that urgently needs to be fixed.
Sarah's point is fair. The RLA actually has an alternative proposal on longer tenancies, and that is to allow tenants the right to renew, and we have proposals out on that. But the fact is that the median average tenancy is something over 3 years. I say the median, because 1 in 3 tenancies already lasts 3 years. So there isn't a need to change the current system. What happens, of course, is, if a tenant comes to me, I'll do referencing and so forth, but I'm not going to sign them up straight away for a 3-year tenancy. I'll perhaps give them 6 months of probationary. And as Alex said, there's an awful lot of people who want shorter tenancies because they need the mobility. Now I recognise that a third of the market is the family market. I don't know a single landlord who wants to get rid of a tenant that is paying their rent and behaving responsibly for that. As John said, a private negotiation between the landlord and the tenant will solve that. There is a factor in the market, the role of the agent, and also the influence of the council mortgage lenders, because they, for a start, with a recent exception, require tenancies to be not longer than 12 months. Again, for this ground of repossession. So there are things to be sorted out there. David, I'm going to look forward to further conversations with you on this. We can't cherry pick the best bits from Germany or from Switzerland. There's a totally different taxation structure there. And when you take on a tenancy in Germany, the rent initially tends to be higher, and then if that is fixed, it reduces over time against inflation. I can see the attraction for the corporate investors, because if they're borrowing over 20 and 30-year terms, and they want to fix and do that, that's fine. But as a private landlord, I can't get those sort of deals. And as I said, I don't want a 2-tier market. So my message is, if you want to fix, you carry on, but I can't afford to.
Okay, very good. So I'm going to then, I think, call it a day. If we can have you all two together, that would be very helpful.
My name is Tim Briggs. I'm the founder of legalmentor.co.uk Landlords. We essentially help landlords with problem tenants. I'd love to respond to some of the points made by Alan. Very, very interesting points about Article 4 and restrictions, rent controls, and so on. But really, my question is for Alex, and it's this: Alex, you talk about the planning system not being fit for purpose, and perhaps this is a question that I should be asking Nick Bowles, but I'm going to ask you instead.
We're both on a platform tomorrow at a policy exchange event. So
excellent. I'll come to that as well. What's your understanding of the problems with the current system? What would be your ideal system to accommodate the difficulties in the provision of housing at the moment? What would you do to create a system that would work?
Okay. Come along tomorrow, I'll be able to explain more. Basically, the system was designed in 1947 when the idea was that you would empower a local bureaucracy that would decide how many houses we needed, where they would go, what they would look like. That system essentially is still in place today. The problem is the houses aren't sufficient quality. We try to micromanage what they should look like, often to the detriment of how they appear, and instead of allowing local people to decide, there is often a sort of high density, unrealistic codes applied. So the point being, like I said, you can't build raised ground floors in London. You have to put a lift in the 4th story. You can't build narrow stairways because they can't put a standard stair lift. So all these things have unintended consequences. So ultimately, the planning system does not work on the principles that the rest of our economy works on. So I can't go as a developer and say, look, I want to build some houses at the edge of this suburb. What I will do is build a big park, a park for the community, and on the other side, there will be 1,000 homes, and they will look like this. And if you don't like how they look, I will change how they look, because it's in my interest, and the farmer who's selling me the land's interest, to get houses that are, one, going to sell, but two, something the community is satisfied with. That system just does not work, and the problem is that the government consistently attacks NIMBYs. Governments, although I don't think Bowles does, but governments often attack NIMBYs, but when really what they need to do is understand the reasons, unblock that. There is a small minority of unreasonable people in this country who will oppose all development. And those people are just an irreducible, probably 5–10%. But the problem is that the vast majority of people are reasonable, but the system does not listen to their concerns and allow them to be felt.
So what's the system that you...
So I would like if you've got, for example, if you're building at the edge of a wall, and it has to be flexible depending on the scale, you would have a direct, you have to have a neighbourhood plan or even sub-neighbourhood plan approval, as in 50% vote to approve the development. The community decides what the benefits are from the developer, and those who are losing any loss of green space, as in if you're losing a view directly, who are often the people who go to planning committees and make the biggest fuss because they are losing something they've usually paid for because there's a price premium for having that view, those people should be compensated. So that the planning system would be completely liberalised in one sense, but you would retain local control of what quality looks like, what those homes look like, and you would have much more competition amongst developers going, this is the great scheme I want to get through your village, rather than I'm going to get the planning inspector to shove 400 homes down opposite you, and there's not that much you can do about it, because that just doesn't work in the 21st century.
Yes, I mean, before I got elected to the House of Commons, I ran, and I still have an interest in a very small public relations company which gives advice to developers on how to manage the political and the public consultation process as well. I did an enormous amount of work in the Royal Borough Council in Chelsea. The Warwick Road, which you may know goes up from Hall Road upwards. And one of the things that we had real difficulty on the Tesco's, which was there, is actually getting planning permission for a block of flats on the car park. It was a real nightmare, and we got within an ace of getting it, and then we lost it completely. But at the very far end of it, there was also a series of landholdings, which we were campaigning for on behalf of the clients, which were the Prudential and also Berkeley Haynes. And the new director of planning actually handled this incredibly well. That he decided there should be a master plan for the site. He would go out for public consultation on that. He would offer a series of options about the height, the massing, the density, and all of those kind of things too. So that the local community were involved in that process at a very, very, very early stage. That then meant that when we ended up by then submitting a planning application, it was a little bit like, frankly, answering the exam paper where you knew as to what the points were which you had to include in that. And that then went through very easily and very quickly, and we made sure that the local councillors, who were inevitably as politicians, we end up by reacting to what the electorate ended up by saying. The whole thing went through very simply, and I'm delighted to say it's in the process of being built, and it had a lot of green space attached to it as well at the same time. And it just seems to my mind, and I know very well in Plymouth, my constituency, where there is a significant amount of development which takes place. And if I'm honest with you, what damage the Luftwaffe did to Plymouth was only superseded, by the planning officers as well. And there's been the lack of inability by local authorities to actually have a real issue to do with public consultation, taking the local community with them and making sure they do that. And if I were ever, by some misfortune of the world, find myself as a planning minister, the one thing which I would most certainly say is they have got to have a process by which the local community can buy in to the decision-making process. So when you get to the planning committee, people don't throw their hands up. I have to tell you, it was an enormously difficult thing to get the councillors to be interested in it, but they did, after about 3 or 4 years, get it, and they realised that this was one way in which they could actually keep their local communities very much more on the side.
I suppose the difference between myself and Nick Bowles, the partly he deals with the more complicated reality of being the planning minister, is that I think the point you're making is very right, that we have to move to a more conciliatory, negotiated process. I don't believe that you can do that within the local plan system, because the local plan system is like a gun against the head. It basically means that yes, you get better consultation. I don't think you will get enough consultation. And also the 5-year land supply is a bonkers idea. It creates a weird artificial monopoly of, basically, I've been told that my land is the land that's being designated for housing, where land with planning permission for housing is worth 1.5 million, 2 million, 3 million pounds. Of course I'm going to sit on it and speculate. So the planning system as it currently works is based on a sort of command economics of the 1940s, and unsurprisingly it hasn't built a number of homes or the quality of homes since 1947. And the problem is sometimes the Conservative Party and, I exclude Nick Bowles to some extent from this, but often the Conservative Party has been unafraid to say actually the planning system is the enemy, not the NIMBYs. We can't force this through, and neither as Conservatives should we, because we actually think we believe in property rights and consensus and voluntary negotiation. And so rather than making the planning system the sort of focus of our attack, it's been the NIMBY communities, a small proportion are just motivated by, I don't really care that no one has a home to live, but the vast majority of reasonable people whose concerns need to be heard.
The other big issue, of course, is actually the price of land in the first place, which is actually very expensive. If you are doing a development, you know very well that is the most expensive part of it. You can get your planning permission, you can do your building, that is a minor issue, really, but it's the cost of that. So you therefore, if you are a developer, have a limited amount of money that you can spend, and you need to make sure you have a decent number of units which you can end up by selling, you can do. So,
sorry for coming late,
That's
shoot
right.
down if you cover this.
Yeah,
Selective licensing in Bury, just up the road from here.
we haven't discussed selective licensing so far, so you think I'm riveted to find out what we're going to be talking about.
Well, what I heard, this is purely great snippets of information, is that Manchester decided they had a disrepair problem, brought in selective licensing in Bury, and then decided not to continue it. So does anyone know what's happened, what the repercussions were? Because environmental health officers, God bless them, but they do love the idea that they're going to put the world to rights with a licence, which isn't the case.
Sadly, I don't know, but I'm sure there may be someone, and if they're not, then you're very welcome to write to me, and I will then write to the government about it and ask them that question.
Fair enough, nobody knows.
They certainly do that. Unless you have a view on it. No. Do you have a view on it? No, sadly not. We don't. Well, can I thank everybody very much indeed for their involvement in it. Can I thank very much indeed Alan for you for giving us such an excellent synopsis, and Alex, thank you very much for giving us some brains and everything too. And can I just say that there is another event, if you haven't had enough of talking about planning and all those kind of things, Homes for Britain reception, starting at 7:30. Is that right? Have I got that one right?
7:30, yes, it's a reception, so there will be.
And it's in Charter 4, for those of you who want to go and do so. But can I thank you all very much indeed for your really hard work of actually making this such a successful event, and the only event which I'm delighted to say I'm going to be chairing.
Too many parties to go to.
So I have, you're quite right. Probably at 6 o'clock at night as well, on whatever. So thank you very much indeed. Have a very